Hello, good evening. It's 8 o'clock. This is the UK Tonight with a special extended programme live from Downing Street. A dramatic return to public life. Former Prime Minister David Cameron is named as the new Foreign Secretary.
I believe in public service. The Prime Minister asked me to do this job, and it's a time where we have some daunting challenges as a country.
Lord Cameron, as he's now known, was the headline announcement in a cabinet reshuffle prompted by the sacking of Suella Braverman. The former Home Secretary's article in the Times newspaper, described as inflammatory and divisive by critics, was the final straw for the Prime Minister, who is now seeking to reset his government before a general election. Well, Rishi Sunak will be speaking later this hour. He's giving a major foreign policy speech in the City of London. We'll bring that to you live at 8:30. Also tonight, an investigation is launched after 5 members of a family, including 3 children, died in a fire at a house in West London. The World Health Organization says UK families are being exploited by formula makers and the government must step in. This is after Sky News revealed the desperate measures that are being taken by parents who can't afford to feed their babies. And one of the greatest of all time, the funeral of England legend Sir Bobby Charlton takes place in Manchester. All that to come and much more on the UK Tonight. Hello and good evening to you live from Downing Street with this extended edition of the UK Tonight. Well, for days, weeks, even months, those in the know in Westminster have been telling us that Rishi Sunak was preparing for a reshuffle of his cabinet. And to most people here, it was clear that Suella Braverman would be sacked. But no one predicted a return to public life for David Cameron. Yes, that David Cameron, the former Prime Minister who was today appointed Foreign Secretary. Rishi Sunak and Lord Cameron, as he is now known, have been critical of each other's records in the past. And as the Prime Minister resets his top team, ready for a general election, his decision to bring in one of his predecessors is a real test of his claim to be the candidate of change. Our political editor, Beth Rigby, has our lead report this evening.
The cameras trained on this front door, the PM inside now with everyone's attention after this jaw-dropping addition to his cabinet. The former Prime Minister is back as Foreign Secretary. No one saw David Cameron coming. The Rishi reset is on. Appointing an old PM not without risk, Cameron brings with him a leader's charisma and command.
David Cameron, are you pleased to be back in government, sir?
But complications too, be it Brexit baggage or controversies around his post-Parliament life.
Of course, I've disagreed with some individual decisions, but politics is a team enterprise. I've decided to join this team because I believe Rishi Sunak is a good Prime Minister doing a difficult job at a hard time. I want to support him.
The day started with a vacancy finally opening up after days of speculation.
Have you said back me or sack me to the Prime Minister, Mrs Braverman?
The Home Secretary sacked after her criticism of the police was judged by the PM a step too far.
Are you pleased with the new job, Home Secretary?
The former Foreign Secretary James cleverly moved to the Home Office to replace her.
Do you want to distance yourself from the rhetoric of the previous Home Secretary?
Well, I intend to do this job in the way that I feel best protects the British people and our interests.
Also out to raise coffee, the former Deputy PM to Liz Truss, as Mr Sunak finally put together a cabinet in his own image. Victoria Atkins moved to the health brief, rising star Laura Trott, the Chief Secretary, to the Treasury. And Steve Barclay, the new Environment Secretary. But even as Number 10 briefed this as a new start with new faces, criticism of the return of an old one.
One thing the return of David Cameron doesn't signal is change. You can't fix the problems Rishi Sunak is facing with personnel changes. You can only fix them with policy changes, and the Tory party can't do that.
It doesn't sound like change that Rishi Sunak told us he was going to give. It sounds like desperation.
For months, the Prime Minister's been struggling to get you, the voters, to give him another look. But today he's grabbed all of the attention. Now, putting David Cameron back into the heart of his government might be seen as the very opposite of change, but it is bold. And here's why. Rishi Sunak is finally doing it how he wants to do it. And yes, these cabinet changes will divide, but at this point the calculation has to be, what has he got to lose? Around here, the PM will at least have more confidence of a united cabinet, even as his aides acknowledge this reshuffle will deepen party divisions. A new look cabinet for the country, an election on the horizon. Can they now make it count? Beth Rigby, Sky News, Westminster.
Well, if you're just catching up, let's take you through who's in and who is out after Sunak's reshuffle earlier on today. Suella Braverman sacked as Home Secretary just days after that controversial newspaper article in which she criticised the police. Her replacement is James Cleverly, who leaves his role as Foreign Secretary to become the new Home Secretary. Well, the former Prime Minister David Cameron, now Lord Cameron, after being granted a peerage so he can become the new Foreign Secretary, he is in. Out as well, Therese Coffey. She resigned as Environment Secretary. Her replacement is Steve Barclay, who leaves his role as Health Secretary. In his place, Victoria Atkins, promoted from Financial Secretary to the Treasury. Well, in terms of the big promotions, Laura Trott moves from Pensions Minister to Chief Secretary to the Treasury. And Richard Holden is now Conservative Party Chair, leaving behind his role as Roads and Transport Minister. Oh, let's bring in our Chief Political Correspondent, John Craig, who is with me and has been following the twists and turns of the day. Shall we first start with David Cameron? Because the big thing we expected today was the sacking of Suella Braverman. And then David Cameron got out of that car a few hundred yards down the road here. What has that done to the shape of Rishi Sunak's top team, in your opinion?
Well, it's changed the story, as you rightly say. I mean, probably this morning we all expected to be talking about the right-wing backlash from Suella Braverman's supporters on the back benches. That hasn't happened. I'll tell you about that in a minute. But as soon as I saw David Cameron get out of the car down there, I thought, oh, my word, he looks very serious, very business-like. This
isn't a social
clearly
call.
Not a social call, no. I think what we've learned throughout the day, of course, this has been in the planning for some time. It's had to go through the committee which looks at appointments for ex-prime ministers and ex-ministers and so on. We understand that William Hague was instrumental. Now, William Hague, of course, is Rishi Sunak's predecessor as MP for Richmond up in the Yorkshire Dales, and obviously still close to David Cameron. He was Foreign Secretary under Mr Cameron, as he then was. And I've just been over in Parliament, and the older, more mature MPs, if you like, from the Cameron era, they think this is a masterstroke, a really smart move. They're really pleased by it. I mean, the fact is, Mr Cameron is well known internationally. He'd probably pick up the phone to the likes of Joe Biden, Anthony Blinken, Netanyahu, you name it. Whereas a novice, if you like, probably couldn't do that. So the majority believe it's an inspired appointment. However, of course, the Brexiteers will say, oh, he was a Remainer. And an hour or so ago on Sophie Ridge's Politics Hub programme, we had Theresa Villiers say, oh, he's got to show he supports the current policy on Brexit. So there'll be grumblings about that. But by and large, most Conservative MPs are pretty pleased.
How did it not leak?
Because not many people knew about it. Not many people knew about it. You're absolutely right.
Circle.
I mean, one of our broadcast colleagues said to me when I came up here earlier in the day, well, the Sunday lobby failed in their job, the political editors of the Sunday papers. No, there wasn't a squeak, was there, in the papers, broadcast, nowhere.
Particularly all the hoops that you'd have to jump through, having to get him into the House of Lords.
Yeah.
So, because, of course, he's not an MP. So it's a fascinating tale. I'm sure we'll find out in the fullness of time just how, just what was going on behind the scenes. In terms of the other comings and goings, what does that tell us about the plan from the Conservatives for the general election? Because they'll be on a general election footing, won't they?
Yes, well, I'm particularly interested in the new party chairman. That is Richard Holden, or Rick as a lot of people know him. MP for North West Durham, a red wall seat he won from Labour. Strangely, though, that seat disappeared. So you've got a Tory chairman at the moment who hasn't got a seat to fight at the next election because of boundary changes. Greg Hands has paid the price really, for those disastrous Tory by-election campaigns. And clearly a lot of unhappiness here, the way he fought some of those campaigns. So, new party chairman and those rising stars. Well, I suppose Mr Holden's a rising star, obviously, only elected in 2019. Laura Trott, who goes next door to number 11. She used to work for David Cameron. She's actually got quite an impressive CV as a backroom fixer, if you like. She got an MBE in David Cameron's resignation honours back in 2016. She is clearly one to watch. And so there are newer people, younger people coming in, newly elected. The big surprise, or the other big surprise, was about 5 o'clock. It was getting pretty dark and we couldn't see Esther McVey coming up the street with that unmistakable long blonde hair. Even though it was dark, we realised who it was. And she's got this new job as Minister of State for the Cabinet Office. Some people are calling her the Minister for Common Sense. Well, she's a straight-talking northerner. There was criticism throughout the afternoon. Not many northerners been promoted, and not many women promoted. All that changed as the day went on, with Victoria Atkins getting health, Laura Trott getting Treasury. And now Esther McVey bounces back.
So plenty of changes. We're going to talk about Suella Braverman because, of course, we did think we'd be talking about that, but with the arrival of David Cameron, that's getting all the headlines. But we must talk about Suella Braverman. We'll do that in just a moment, John, because you're going to stay with me here on Downing Street for this extended edition of the UK Tonight. But let's talk more about David Cameron. He walked out of British politics 7 years ago now, after leaving that Remain campaign to defeat in the Brexit referendum. His return to the government as an unelected member of the House of Lords has raised a few questions about accountability, and questions too for the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak over the wisdom of appointing a man who was on the wrong side of the most consequential piece of UK foreign policy in decades. Here's our political correspondent, Rob Powell.
Back in the loop, the 7th Foreign Secretary in as many years for a politician who's been out of office for just as long.
So we'll have a new Prime Minister in that building behind me by Wednesday evening.
It was 2016, after the referendum, that David Cameron resigned as Prime Minister.
Thank you very much.
Singing himself out of Downing Street. Brexit, undoubtedly his biggest foreign policy legacy, leading the Remain campaign, but failing to convince voters.
I do think that David Cameron and Rishi Sunak realise that they do need to work with Europe, and they do need to be in a position where we've got a perhaps better trading position than we have at the moment. So is David Cameron going to suddenly start making all the old Remain arguments? Is he going to go out there and do that? No, he's not.
In office during the Arab Spring, David Cameron was ultimately criticised for the UK's intervention in Libya, with MPs calling it incoherent and ill-informed. On Asia, too, the world has changed since he shared a pint with the Chinese premier and held a golden era in relations.
These days we have a much greater awareness of the security risk posed by China. So I think people will want to hear the assurance from David Cameron that we're not signalling a return to the sort of approach that we saw previously.
Back home, David Cameron criticised the axing of the HS2 rail line to Manchester last month, and he became embroiled in a lobbying scandal after taking a job for the billionaire Lex Greensill and approaching ministers about his now-defunct financial services firm.
There are multi-billion-dollar lawsuits all over the world related to Greensill, and each one of these is going to involve lots of sort of additional information that's going to come out about Cameron's role.
Sniffed at for hunkering down in a luxury shepherd's hut to pen his memoirs while Parliament grappled with Brexit, Lord Cameron now has another chapter to write. His closing words to MPs in 2016 now seeming somewhat premature.
After all, as I once said, I was the future once.
Rob Powell, Sky News in Westminster.
Last month at the Conservative Party conference, as Rishi Sunak tried to sell himself as the candidate of change, he painted his predecessors as part of the failed status quo. Those predecessors, of course, include the man that he has just appointed as Foreign Secretary. And some polling carried out today suggests that the public believes the Prime Minister was wrong to appoint David Cameron, but right to sack Suella Braverman. But what do Conservatives think? Here's our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates.
A party conference propaganda video from the Prime Minister titled Rishi Sunak is change. Its message, a promise to break from decades of failed status quo.
be in no doubt. It is time for a change, and we are it.
The return of an old face, not the change anyone was anticipating.
Private, that's the security detail just opening the door for
David Cameron.
What?
Back to the future with a former PM in the Foreign Office. And back to the centre, too. David Cameron's brand of middle ground Tory politics has long been out of fashion. Suella Braverman had become the face of a new, uncompromising approach.
I think I've been pretty clear that these are hate marches.
With her sacked, a different approach. The new Home Secretary, one of the party's moderates. Unlike his predecessor, James Cleverly won't back tearing up human rights laws to send migrants to Rwanda. This all a shift that delights some on the backbenches.
Rishi Sunak is determined to lead a government that doesn't go off into the wilder shores of politics, that he is representing all Conservative traditions in his cabinet.
The right of the party much less happy. Ex-Minister Andrea Jenkins, the first public letter of no confidence in the PM, saying enough is enough. More anger in private, with Tory MPs telling me the centre-left wing takeover of the party is complete. It won't work any more than his strategy has over the last year. Another said, I wonder if the PM has been suborned by Reform, the right-wing party, as the reshuffle will be a boon for them. Another said, it's desperate and looks like you're flip-flopping. You go one direction one day, one direction the next.
Voters think the Prime Minister was right to sack Suella Braverman, but are less sure about the appointment of David Cameron. Just 1 in 4 voters support bringing him back as Foreign Secretary. But Conservative strategists know he has a different job: to shore up Tory heartlands. After years of talking about the Red Wall, it feels like that strategy is shifting.
Suella Braverman's Fareham constituency has been Tory blue for decades. Even here, voters are split.
What she said was right, is what everybody was thinking.
I'm really happy, and we're just hoping she doesn't have to be our MP next time as well.
The government is woke. You know, they are literally going against the wishes of the people again.
A focus on Tory heartlands like this means beating a retreat elsewhere. Another reinvention. Sam Coates, Sky News.
I'm joined now by Tim Bale, Professor Tim Bale, author and Professor of Politics at Queen Mary University of London. Good of you to join us on the UK tonight. Now the shock has worn off, I think, of David Cameron walking down the road here on Downing Street to be appointed as the new Foreign Secretary. What do you make of his appointment?
Well, I think as Sam was saying there probably is an intention on the part of Rishi Sunak to some extent send a signal to perhaps more liberal Conservative voters, the kind of people who voted Conservative between 2010 and 2015, that the party hasn't wholly gone away from them towards the populist radical right. That might make a difference perhaps to some of those who may have been tempted perhaps to vote for the Liberal Democrats, as we've seen in some of the by-elections that have recently taken place. Whether it will make a difference to enough voters right across the country, I think, is a very moot point.
There's one thing bringing him in. There's another thing bringing him in as Foreign Secretary, as many people were quick to point out. You know, a lot of strings had to be pulled to get him into that position because, of course, he's not an MP. He had to enter the House of Lords. And in that role, he won't be able to speak in the Commons. He won't be able to be questioned on any foreign policy. And this is right in the middle of, you know, the UK being involved in what's happening in Ukraine and what's happening in the Middle East. How do you see that playing out? Because that's quite a difficult position for a Foreign Secretary.
Yeah, I think that is a bit of a problem for debates in the House of Commons. I have to say he can, of course, appear in front of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And, of course, he will be subject to scrutiny in the House of Lords. And often some people argue that, in fact, the House of Lords does a better job of scrutinising the government than the Commons. But for those set pieces, yes, he will be absent, and that could be a problem. But then again, he will be appearing on the media a great deal. David Cameron is a very fluent communicator, and I think that will help the government's case in many ways.
In terms of his pedigree to be Foreign Secretary, again, a lot of people have said, you know, the Brexit vote, that was one of the most, you know, consequential pieces of foreign policy to to face this country, and he was on the wrong side of that vote. There's also, the Libya crisis, he was involved in that, a vote on Syria. A lot of people are saying, is his foreign policy pedigree up to it? Yes, he's a former prime minister, but did he get some of those big calls right?
Well, I mean, I think you made a very good point there. It's all very well arguing that he was prime minister for 6 years, and obviously he has a great contacts book. And in fact, of course, he's been jet setting all over the world since 2016, making speeches, doing some lobbying. But you're right to suggest that perhaps some of those big calls, Brexit, Libya, Syria, he did run into trouble in many ways. So he's got far from the perfect CV, I think, for a foreign secretary. On the other hand, he has got a great deal of experience. He's used to dealing, with military flashpoints. He's used to dealing with other heads of state and obviously with foreign ministers as well. So, I think as far as the diplomacy goes, David Cameron is a good person to have around. But yes, certainly you could question his judgment as prime minister in many of the things he got up to then.
You could also question how his relationship is going to be with Rishi Sunak, because it was only a couple of weeks ago when Rishi Sunak was convincing, the Conservative Party conference that he was the candidate of change. 30 years of the status quo, he is something different. Of course, David Cameron played a large part in those 30 years. That's what Rishi Sunak's to say. On the other side of it, David Cameron has been critical of the current Prime Minister over HS2 most recently. How do you think that's going to play out? Because, of course, he has got the foreign brief, but he'll be part of the cabinet deciding on domestic policy as well. What will his role be there, do you think?
Well, I think he probably won't try and interfere too much on domestic policy. I think any other brief than foreign affairs wouldn't have seen David Cameron come into the government. I think he'll stick very much to that. Clearly, when he appears on the media, he may well be asked questions about government policy and he will have to toe the line. I don't think that will be too difficult. Let's face it, David Cameron has always worn his ideology fairly lightly. I don't think he'll have any trouble actually buckling down to that kind of collective responsibility that other cabinet members have to stick to. You're right to say that on HS2 there is a disagreement, but that's done and dusted now, really. I don't think David Cameron's going to get involved in that again. I think the other problem, though, for David Cameron is, of course, he was also one of the co-architects of austerity. So it will be actually quite difficult for him, I think, to completely avoid questions about, for example, the health service coming under extreme strain, concrete falling down around schools.
And of course, he was the Prime Minister of austerity as well, wasn't he, of course?
Absolutely. So, he won't be able to escape, I think, people asking him about some of the consequences of those policies. So although I think he'd like to stick to foreign affairs, I don't think it'll be completely possible, certainly when it comes to journalists.
Well, he was just, talking earlier today. Obviously, he's a former Prime Minister, so he knows how to talk to the media. He was questioned over domestic policy, and he said, I'm here to be a team player. He signed up for collective responsibility. Just a final question to you, if I may, Professor, and it's about the public view of David Cameron. Of course, Rishi Sunak now playing the long game into a general election. This appointment doesn't change everything, but what does it do in the run-up to a general election, do you think?
Well, I do think that people who are talking about some kind of reset, some kind of, game-changing event here are really exaggerating, to be honest. Governments lose elections because of the fundamentals rather than who is or who isn't brought into the cabinet with a year to go before a general election. And those fundamentals, and we're talking here about the economy, we're talking here about the state of the NHS, and we're talking in particular about people's views of the Prime Minister. They're not changed, I think, by this. And of course, they're all pointing in a fairly negative direction for the Conservative Party. So, while David Cameron's appointment has probably grabbed a few headlines quite usefully for Rishi Sunak, really, considering he also had to sack Suella Braverman, I don't think necessarily it's going to represent any great difference to the government's standing as far as the public are concerned.
OK, interesting to talk to you, Professor Tim Bale, their political author. Thanks for joining us on the UK Tonight. Still to come on the programme, we're keeping an eye on the City of London, the Lord Mayor's banquet. Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, due to give a major foreign policy speech at around 8:30, so around 6 minutes' time. We'll bring that to you live. Stay with us here on Sky News.
I'm David Blevins, and I'm Sky's senior Ireland correspondent. I'm based in Belfast, a city transformed by peace, but still struggling with its past. Politically, the two sides are as far apart as ever, and it's over that question of who has sovereignty in Northern Ireland, the very issue that's been the source of tension here for generations.
It takes 60 minutes to cross the Irish Sea. It took the British monarchy a century.
I've spent 25 years reporting the journey from conflict to peace.
The political parties of Northern Ireland have reached agreement.
We help you understand the world with us.
Today, we have reached an agreement with the Conservative Party on support for government in Parliament.
We already know what the government gets out of this deal. What exactly does the DUP get out of it? Well, £1.5 billion. Welcome to Winterfell. It's an iconic location in this globally acclaimed drama.
Ophelia was the most powerful hurricane this far east in the Atlantic on record.
You can't live in a place like this and not appreciate the environment.
The five of us have made it out of the car.
Welcome to Backstage, the film and TV podcast.
Welcome back to the UK Tonight, an extended edition this evening. We're with you until 10 o'clock because of that big cabinet reshuffle today. Our senior political correspondent John Craigie is alongside me because we're standing by for a foreign policy speech at the Lord Mayor's banquet in the City of London by Rishi Sunak. What are we expecting from that, John?
Well, obviously a lot about the twin threats, I think we could call it, the war in the Middle East and obviously the war in Ukraine. Yep. I vaguely remember last year, I think the speech was all about China and British attitude to China. There probably won't be so much of that today. But what we are expecting, of course, is a major speech about the threat in the Middle East and, of course, Ukraine as well. Now, the PM is going to talk about the UK's role, obviously, and he's going to talk about what the UK can do. It'd be interesting to see if he mentions Mr. I keep calling him Mr.
Lord Cameron.
I'm so used to talking about Mr. Cameron. He will talk about the UK's role and the usual stuff we hear about a hard-headed, pragmatic approach and so on. He's also going to talk about how this is such an important year for foreign policy and diplomacy. And, of course, this comes, just a couple of days before, over in the House of Commons, there's the potential of a vote on an SNP amendment to the King's speech calling for a ceasefire. Now, of course, one or two Conservatives have backed that call, but not very many. One thinks of Crispin Blunt. And on that split really is on the Labour side rather than on the Conservative side. But it's the first Prime Minister's questions of the new session on Wednesday as well. So we probably hear both Sir Keir Starmer and Mr. Sunak talking about that. But he will want to talk about the UK's role in the diplomatic moves that are being made. Now, the phrase we keep hearing at the moment is a humanitarian pause, isn't it?
Yes.
Which both Mr. Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer seem to be supporting. So I think we'll probably hear a bit more about that. But it won't just be about the Middle East. He will talk about all the challenges. He'll no doubt talk a bit about Putin's war in Ukraine as well.
We don't expect Lord Cameron to be at the banquet tonight. We understand the Chancellor's there. For those people just tuning into us this evening, who are probably tuning in because of the Cabinet reshuffle, explain to us the significance of the Lord Mayor's banquet and why this key foreign policy speech is done there.
It was on Saturday. It was the Lord Mayor's show.
Yeah.
So the Lord Mayor who's going to speak before the PM tonight is the new one. afraid I don't know his name. I should do.
Oh, my producer will tell me in a minute.
But it's a tradition. It's a very glittering. I've been to loads of these. Normally, if it hadn't been reshuffled today, I'd have been there.
No, we've got you out in the cold instead of some glitz to do. I'm so sorry.
I don't mind that, but
Michael Mainelli, I'm being told.
Right,
Is that the correct pronunciation, Neil, my producer?
Now, on the Middle East, Mr. Sunak's expected to say the UK wrote the original UN resolution setting out a two-state solution.
Okay.
We've argued for it for decades, but now we must help make it a reality. So to the UK's friends across the region and to our communities in this country, I pledge to redouble British efforts to this end. So that, of course, is coming on the back of those huge demonstrations, the big march we saw in London on Saturday. So he's clearly not just talking to a foreign audience, but he's talking to some of the communities in this country who are unhappy with the UK's refusal so far to back that ceasefire. So a delicate path as ever on these things. On Russia, he's going to say the last year has shown that Russia cannot win. Since their invasion, Russia has suffered over 250,000 casualties. Half of the territory they seized has been taken back, and Putin has faced a more united response than he ever imagined. Those two paragraphs are from words that were briefed overnight by Downing Street. I talked about being hard-headed. We are hard-headed about what's necessary for our interests and security, but Britain's realism has always had values, and this is a moment for moral clarity. So he's talking about treaties and alliances and so on. Now, is that a little hint that perhaps he's got no plans to get out of the European Court of Human Rights, which the likes of Suella Braverman want to do? Interesting that he's talking about the UK's role in setting up the UN. That was after the war, and NATO. I'm not sure if he mentions NATO, but clearly it's these occasions are full of diplomats, business people. I think we've seen the Chancellor of the Exchequer there. Yep. Perhaps, I'm not sure if the Foreign Secretary normally goes, but I think perhaps if we hadn't had a new Foreign Secretary today, he might have been there. But it's a big occasion, and of course the eyes of the world will be on it. Gordon Brown, of course, never wore the white tie and tails when he used to go to these, but I think Mr. Sunak will, as far as I know.
Well, we're waiting for that speech to start. It is due around 8:30, but we know how these things overrun. And the Prime Minister probably won't mention it in his speech, but we can talk about it now because it sort of got lost in the David Cameron surprise. But the sacking of the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, we understand Tamara Cohen, our political correspondent I saw earlier, was saying that it was done by phone. They're not going to exchange letters, which is highly unusual.
Well, compare that with Therese Coffey today. The Therese Coffey one, actually, just for a second, was interesting because she came up the street quite early on this morning.
Which you don't normally do if you're going.
Normally, it's ministers who are either moving or being promoted or moved that come up. And it was all quite cordial with Therese Coffey. It doesn't seem as though it was with Suella Braverman. I can tell you about a meeting that's taken place in Parliament this evening in the last hour or so. A group calling themselves the New Conservatives. Now, this is the real right-wing hard men and hard women, if you like, the real hardline Brexiteers and the ones who are really tough on the stop the boats policy, the big supporters of the Rwanda policy and so on. Now, we were expecting a pretty angry backlash when they had a meeting in a committee room over in Parliament. There were only about 12 MPs in the room. They said another 8 were on Zoom. And it'd probably be unfair to call it half-hearted, but there was no great anger and fury. What we are expecting to happen is Suella Braverman, I don't know if you noticed today, she put out a statement saying, I'm going to have more to say soon.
Yeah, I bet she has.
What we think is going to happen, talking to her friends on the back benches, is that on Wednesday, crucial day, the Supreme Court ruling on the Rwanda policy, she will react to that, whichever way it goes, and she may well speak in the Commons debate, because they've been doing NHS today in the King's Speech debate. Tomorrow it's the economy. Wednesday it's law and order. So that's her chance to speak, whether it's a personal statement, which sacked ministers are entitled to, or whether she just gets up and speaks during the debate. So Wednesday's the day I think we'll hear from Suella Braverman in the House of Commons.
What What kind of tone do you think that will be? Because, you know, when you say, I've got more to say, that's quite loaded, isn't it? Few words, but a lot behind it. What do you think we'll get from Suella Braverman? Do you think she'll be... gunning for Rishi Sunak in a certain sense?
May well be, yes. Sometimes these speeches by sacked ministers can be very bitter. And the most famous one of all time probably is the Geoffrey Howe against Thatcher all those years ago. But I'm thinking about people like David Mellor and other ministers who've been sacked, quite bitter. And others just make a very short speech because they're so grumpy and fed up, and you know they have to apologise for doing something wrong. I mean, that doesn't apply here.
Yeah.
But I think she'll probably let Rishi Sunak have it with both barrels. If, of course, the government wins in the Supreme Court, she'll probably be able to say, "Oh, I'm vindicated. This is my policy. It's working. It's stopping the boats. The flights to Rwanda can start." If the government loses, however, she will probably have a real go at the Human Rights Act, the European Court of Human Rights, and say it's time for the UK to pull out. But reading the words from the PM tonight, it's all about alliances and treaties. Doesn't look as though he's going down that road.
What happens to Suella Braverman next?
Well, everybody's been claiming, haven't they, with some justification, that she's poised to launch a leadership bid at some point. Now, I can tell you from being over in Parliament tonight, her support at the moment is not great because there's not many people are going around and say, "Oh, poor Suella, she's been very harshly treated." Most MPs are saying that she deserved to be sacked. And a lot of Tory MPs are talking up the leadership prospects of James Cleverly tonight.
Ooh, interesting. Because, of course, James Cleverly is now
Home
the
Secretary.
Home Secretary. OK, that's interesting. We understand that the Prime Minister should be getting to his feet shortly to make this speech. If you're just joining us, remind us what we could expect from the Prime Minister tonight.
Well, it's a foreign policy speech to a lot of diplomats, top business people, and it's all about Middle East and Russia, Ukraine.
Well, here he is. Let's listen to the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, at the Lord Mayor's banquet.
My Lord Mayor, ladies, gentlemen, these are deeply challenging times for our world. Events far beyond our shores echo here at home, with implications for our security, our economy, and our very social fabric. It falls to us to do everything we can to shape these events. And so we've delivered one of the most significant years for British foreign policy in recent times. That's due in no small part to James Cleverly, and I know that he'll bring the same vigour to the equally vital job of Home Secretary. And I'm pleased to have appointed a new Foreign Secretary who will build on everything that we have achieved in the last year. A year in which we've gone further than ever to support Ukraine, as the first G7 country to move on sending tanks, first to send long-range weapons, and the first to step up on training pilots. In the last few weeks, I've travelled to Cyprus, Jerusalem, Riyadh and Cairo to respond to the crisis in the Middle East, and I'm in constant contact with leaders across the nations. Since we've gathered last here a year ago, we've secured the Windsor Framework with the EU, launched the AUKUS partnership with the US and Australia, building one of the most advanced submarines that the world has ever known, signed the Hiroshima Accord with Japan and the Atlantic Declaration with the United States, secured membership of the CPTPP, which will drive global growth, delivered returns agreements to tackle illegal migration, an approach now being followed by many others, and brokered the first ever international statement on the risks of artificial intelligence, including the US and China, something many thought impossible. But these treaties and alliances speak to something deeper. Our willingness to act, to shape the world, not be shaped by it, wherever there's a challenge, wherever there's a threat, wherever we can promote peace and security. That's why we've deployed troops to Kosovo, supporting stability in the Balkans. 20,000 servicemen and women are on their way to protect NATO's eastern flank and the High North. Royal Navy vessels are in the Middle East to deter further escalation. And vital humanitarian aid is reaching civilians in Gaza and across the Horn of Africa, funded by the British people. This is who we are. The difference we make every single day across the world should make each and every one of us here tonight enormously proud of what this country does. We're hard-headed about our interests and our security. But Britain's realism has always had values, and this is a moment for moral clarity. My Lord Mayor, the past is trying to stop the future being born. What motivated Hamas to launch their horrific attack on Israel? It wasn't just hatred. It was also their fear that a new Middle East was being born, one that would see Israel normalizing relations with its neighbors, which gave hope for a better, more secure, more prosperous way forward. Why did Russia invade Ukraine? Because Putin feared the emergence of a modern, reforming, thriving democracy on his doorstep and wanted to pull it back into some imperialist fantasy of the past. So we must keep alive the promise of a better future, bolster those striving for it, and stand up for the innocents who Russia see as targets and Hamas see as human shields. I recall those lines from Yeats. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. That's what our adversaries believe. So we will outmatch them with our conviction and intensity. We must and we will prove them wrong. And let me set out what that means in Ukraine, in how we help the most vulnerable around the world, and first in the Middle East, a region whose tragedy and heartbreak hang heavy on us all. In Israel, I met the families of British victims. I sat with them, held their hands, and saw the profound pain in their eyes. I heard the existential fear that the Israelis are feeling. Their country was founded to ensure that what happened in the Holocaust could never happen again. Hamas poses a fundamental challenge to that idea. Hamas have stated clearly, we will repeat the October 7th attack time and time again until Israel is annihilated. Time and time again. Last week was the 85th anniversary of Kristallnacht. And as we see hatred rising, we all have a responsibility to meet the promise of the words that in recent days have lit up the Brandenburg Gate. Never again is now. So Israel must be able to defend itself against terror, restore its security, and bring the hostages home. But there are many things that Israel must do as part of its response. We've been clear that they must act within international law. They must take all measures to protect innocent civilians, including at hospitals, stop extremist violence in the West Bank, and allow more aid into Gaza. Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, described to me the terrible suffering of the Palestinian people. Too many civilians are losing their lives. That's why I've doubled our aid to Gaza and why we continue to press, both at the United Nations and directly with Israel, for unhindered humanitarian access and urgent and substantive humanitarian pauses. We want aid coming in by land, air and sea, and we're ready to use our bases in Cyprus as a staging post. Alleviating the suffering is our most foremost priority, but we need to do more to create a new political horizon. We must unite around the only answer that can come close to creating peace in these troubled lands. The only answer that can acknowledge the history and hurt of both peoples. The only answer that can allow a new future to be born, and that is a two-state solution. The United Kingdom wrote the original UN resolutions setting this out. We've argued the case for decades, but now we must help make it a reality. So to the UK's friends across the region, like Jordan, Egypt, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, who support normalization and peaceful coexistence, and to our communities here at home, I pledge to redouble our efforts to this end. That means providing the serious, practical, and enduring support needed to bolster the Palestinian Authority, because they are the best route to sweep away the terrible scourge of Hamas and all it has wrought. As hard as it may be, no matter the obstacles, we must put the region on a path to genuine peace. Now, we're also supporting a better future for Ukraine. And let me tell you this, the last year has shown that Russia cannot win. They tried to blockade Ukrainian shipping routes, and they failed. Ukraine has pushed back the Black Sea Fleet and made Crimea a vulnerability for Putin rather than a strength. Russia is mounting its third wave of attacks on Avdiivka, and again they continue to fail at horrendous cost. Since their invasion, Russia has suffered over 250,000 casualties. Half the territory they initially seized has been taken back, and Putin has faced a more united response than he ever imagined. He ensured defense spending is rising across Europe, led by the UK. He's fast-tracked Finland into NATO with Sweden close behind. And he's seen an armed rebellion marching on Moscow. It's a self-inflicted strategic calamity. Putin's vain hope is that we lose patience. But friends, we never will. Instead, we're providing more air defense to protect Ukraine's cities and infrastructure, more help for the long, hard winter, and we're going further. In February, at the Munich Security Conference, I argued then that Ukraine needs long-term security assurances. And in July, allies delivered. Following the NATO summit, over 30 other leaders joined us in agreeing to put those assurances in place. Together, we'll strengthen Ukraine's defense and boost their economy so that they can thrive even while they fight to regain their territory. And to do so, Ukraine needs the City of London. It needs all of you. It needs expertise and capital and war risk insurance to support trade and investment and keep the ships going. And I know that you will deliver. And so will the government, building Ukraine's navy, training their pilots, and training their soldiers. We've now trained over 50,000 Ukrainian troops. President Zelensky and I went to meet some of them earlier this year. And I recall sitting together on a Chinook flying to the south coast. Over the din of the rotors, Vladimir and I chatted and shared family photos. It was a moment of normality in an abnormal setting and a reminder of what unites us. In the face of aggression, we will always protect our values and all we hold dear. We will stand with Ukraine until they prevail. And finally, to deliver a better future, we must lead not just with our strength, but with our compassion, helping the poorest and tackling global problems. So while Russia seeks to starve the world by choking off food supplies, we're helping Ukraine get food to those who need it most. And next week, we're hosting an international conference on alleviating global hunger. While some load the poorest nations with unsustainable debt, the UK is driving fundamental reform of development finance, including a capital increase for the World Bank. While some talk down our record on climate, we're actually a world leader, cutting emissions faster than any other G7 country. And with $2 billion recently announced for the Green Climate Fund, I've delivered the biggest single international climate pledge the UK has ever made. We're also a leading donor to global health initiatives, helping vaccinate over 1 billion children, saving millions and millions of lives. But we bring more to the table than just our funding. We also bring our expertise. Right now, the world's first ever malaria vaccine is being rolled out across Africa, with the second one following soon. It has dramatically cut early child mortality. And where were both of those vaccines developed? Right here in the UK. We don't talk about it enough, but every day Britain is out there helping the poorest, the most vulnerable, saving and transforming lives. So I say it again, this is who we are, and it should make us all proud. My Lord Mayor, when conflicts overseas create division at home, it's more important than ever that we preserve the values we hold dear. Tolerance, free speech, the rule of law, respect for our history. We'll protect all communities from violence and intimidation and prevent people being drawn into radicalization. In these dangerous times, we're not just defending a better vision of the future against those who would destroy it, we're marshalling our expertise, our people, and our alliances to bring that future into being. We will continue to stand up for what is right. We will stand with our allies and the most vulnerable wherever they may be. We'll show that the best are full of conviction and that our values will prevail. Thank you.
The Prime Minister Rishi Sunak there delivering that foreign policy speech at the Lord Mayor's banquet, ending by saying, so we will continue to stand up for what is right and show that our values will prevail. Our senior political correspondent John Craig was listening to that speech alongside me here in Downing Street. John, what did you make of what the Prime Minister had to say? Strong finish there.
Yes, three key sections really, Israel and the Middle East, Ukraine, and then that passage which was clearly a reference to events in the UK over the past 48 hours or so, about healing divisions really, here at home, he said. Now, the passage in the middle really about the Middle East, very sombre and serious, wasn't it? I mean, that was a very serious speech, for serious times, if you like. Where he talked about the tragedy and heartbreak of what's happening in the Middle East. And he talked about the various trips he'd had to Riyadh and Cyprus and various other places and the talks he'd had. He talked about Israel's right to defend itself, but at the same time, of course, acts within international law, of course. And talked about getting more aid in. He talked about, in fact, early on, where he was quick run through of what British troops and aid are doing around the world. He mentioned the aid to Gaza, how it was getting in there, and of course the Royal Navy ships that are out in the Eastern Mediterranean. Then the passage about Ukraine, he talked about his talks with President Zelensky. It was a touching little bit, wasn't there? But he talked about looking at their photos of the children and so on. Of course, obviously, he talked about seeing for himself what's happening over in Ukraine. Strong passage attacking Putin, of course. And then on Ukraine, to his audience of top businessmen.
Yeah, they need you.
Yes, you could say the city fat cats with the deep pockets. He said, he talked about them providing insurance, investment and so on in Ukraine. That's right, an appeal to them to dig deep into their pockets. And then that piece at the end about the divisions at home, which we've seen on the streets of the capital at the weekend.
Yeah, because he did make reference to defending free speech, which of course has been a hot topic of debate, given what's going on in the Middle East and the UK's connection to it, whether it be personal or political. And that's a debate that rumbles on. In terms of the overall tone, do you think he got it right? We always knew it was going to be serious and weighty because of the conflicts unfolding. But what did you make of it?
Well, I mean, it was predictable. But I remember I said that last year, I seem to recall, there was a big passage about the attitude towards China. There was nothing on that. And I wonder if some of we call them the China hawks on the Tory backbenches, MPs like Ian Duncan-Smith, might have wanted a bit more a tougher language on China. There was nothing about China, I don't think, in the speech, was there?
No, I didn't hear anything.
It was dominated. I think, to be fair to him, it was right, I think, to dominate the speech with the two most pressing issues, the Middle East and Ukraine. And I think he made his points pretty well there. And there was a bit of poetry. He quoted Yeats at one point, didn't he? That was early on in the speech. I think people and the international audience will have listened to that, and he will have hoped that they will have felt reassured that the UK was playing a key part in diplomacy, in aid, and indeed military help, for the warships and so on. Oh, and there was a new figure, I think, on 50,000 troops, Ukraine troops being trained by the UK.
OK, John, thank you. John Craig, our senior political correspondent there, with his upsum of the Prime Minister's speech at the Lord Mayor's banquet. We're going to take a quick break and have a look at the weather now.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
It's going to be an unsettled week with further spells of wind and rain after the Irish named storm Debbie today. Central and southern parts are going to be very windy this evening with a scattering of heavy showers. But the worst of the gales will be gone. Scotland and northern England will see some more general showery rain. Most parts will see a scattering of blustery, locally heavy and thundery showers tonight, likely merging over the southwest to give some more general rain by dawn. It's going to be quite mild and still quite windy for most of us. Tomorrow morning, we're looking at sunny spells and a scattering of heavy showers to most, frequent and prolonged over Scotland and southern England for some time. Southwestern parts, they look like having the best of any sunshine, while the far north will probably stay mainly dry. Little change throughout the afternoon, although the southeast will probably dry up a little later. Wednesday looking fine, if breezy for most of us, but there will be further showery rain in the north, easing later.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Still to come on the UK tonight, David Cameron returns to government in a move that even he acknowledges is unusual. We'll have more live from Downing Street. It's 9 o'clock. This is the UK Tonight, the special extended programme for you live from Downing Street. A dramatic return to public life. Former Prime Minister David Cameron is named as the new Foreign Secretary.
I believe in public service. The Prime Minister asked me to do this job, and it's a time where we have some daunting challenges as a country.
Lord Cameron, as he is now known, was the headline announcement in a cabinet reshuffle prompted by the sacking of Suella Braverman. The former Home Secretary's article in The Times, described as inflammatory and divisive by critics, was the final straw for the Prime Minister, who is now seeking to reset his government before a general election. Well, Rishi Sunak gave a major foreign policy speech in the City of London this evening and says he is pleased to appoint Lord Cameron to his new role. We'll have more on that in just a moment. Also tonight, an investigation is launched after 5 members of a family, including 3 children, died in a fire at a house in West London. The World Health Organization says UK families are being exploited by formula makers and the government must step in. This is after Sky News revealed the desperate measures being taken by parents who can't afford to feed their babies. And one of the greatest of all time, the funeral of England legend Sir Bobby Charlton takes place in Manchester. All that and more to come right here on the UK Tonight. Hello, good evening to you from Downing Street for an extended edition of the UK Tonight. For days, weeks, even months, those in the know in Westminster have been telling us that Rishi Sunak was preparing for a reshuffle of his cabinet. And to most people here, it was clear that Suella Braverman would be sacked. But no one predicted a return to public life for David Cameron. Yes, that David Cameron, the former Prime Minister who was today appointed Foreign Secretary. Rishi Sunak and Lord Cameron, as he is now known, have been critical of each other's records in the past. And as the Prime Minister resets his top team ready for a general election, his decision to bring in one of his predecessors is a real test of his claim to be the candidate of change. Our political editor, Beth Rigby, has our lead report this evening.
The cameras trained on this front door, the PM inside now with everyone's attention after this jaw-dropping addition to his cabinet. The former Prime Minister is back as Foreign Secretary. No one saw David Cameron coming. The Rishi reset is on. Appointing an old PM not without risk, Cameron brings with him a leader's charisma and command.
David Cameron, are you pleased to be back in government, sir?
But complications too, be it Brexit baggage or controversies around his post-Parliament life.
Of course, I've disagreed with some individual decisions, but politics is a team enterprise. I've decided to join this team because I believe Rishi Sunak is a good Prime Minister doing a difficult job at a hard time. I want to support him.
The day started with a vacancy finally opening up after days of speculation.
Have you said back me or sack me to the Prime Minister, Mrs Braverman?
The Home Secretary sacked after her criticism of the police was judged by the PM a step too far.
Are you pleased with the new job, Home Secretary?
The former Foreign Secretary James cleverly moved to the Home Office to replace her.
Do you want to distance yourself from the rhetoric of the previous Home Secretary?
Well, I intend to do this job in the way that I feel best protects the British people and our interests.
Also out to raise coffee, the former Deputy PM to Liz Truss, as Mr Sunak finally put together a cabinet in his own image. Victoria Atkins moved to the health brief, rising star Laura Trott, the Chief Secretary, to the Treasury, and Steve Barclay, the new Environment Secretary. But even as Number 10 briefed this as a new start with new faces, criticism of the return of an old one.
One thing the return of David Cameron doesn't signal is change. You can't fix the problems Rishi Sunak is facing with personnel changes. You can only fix them with policy changes, and the Tory party can't do that.
It doesn't sound like change that Rishi Sunak told us he was going to give. It sounds like desperation.
For months, the Prime Minister's been struggling to get you, the voters, to give him another look. But today he's grabbed all of the attention. Now, putting David Cameron back into the heart of his government might be seen as the very opposite of change, but it is bold. And here's why. Rishi Sunak is finally doing it how he wants to do it. And yes, these cabinet changes will divide, but at this point, the calculation has to be, what has he got to lose? Around here, the PM will at least have more confidence of a united cabinet, even as his aides acknowledge this reshuffle will deepen party divisions. A new look cabinet for the country, an election on the horizon. Can they now make it count? Beth Rigby, Sky News, Westminster.
So if you're just catching up, let's take you in through who's in and who is out after Rishi Sunak's reshuffle today. Well, Suella Braverman was sacked as Home Secretary just days after her controversial newspaper article criticising the police. Her replacement is James Cleverly, who leaves his role as Foreign Secretary to become the new Home Secretary. Former Prime Minister David Cameron, now Lord Cameron, after being granted a peerage to become the new Foreign Secretary. Therese Coffey, she resigned as Environment Secretary today. Her replacement, Steve Barclay, who leaves his role as Health Secretary. In his place, Victoria Atkins. She is promoted from Financial Secretary to the Treasury. In terms of the big promotions today, Laura Trott moves from Pensions Minister to Chief Secretary to the Treasury. And Richard Holden is now Conservative Party Chair, leaving behind his role as Roads and Transport Minister. The Prime Minister has been given a major foreign policy speech in the City of London this evening, and in it he stressed the importance of upholding British values when conflicts overseas affect us at home, a reference, it would appear, to the disorder in London at the weekend. And he told the audience that he was pleased to appoint Lord Cameron to the role of Foreign Secretary.
We've delivered one of the most significant years for British foreign policy in recent times. That's due in no small part to James Cleverly, and I know that he'll bring the same vigour to the equally vital job of Home Secretary. And I'm pleased to have appointed a new Foreign Secretary who will build on everything that we have achieved in the last year. When conflicts overseas create division at home, it's more important than ever that we preserve the values we hold dear. Tolerance, free speech, the rule of law, respect for our history. We'll protect all communities from violence and intimidation and prevent people being drawn into radicalisation. In these dangerous times, we're not just defending a better vision of the future against those who would destroy it, we're marshalling our expertise, our people and our alliances to bring that future into being. We will continue to stand up for what is right. We will stand with our allies and the most vulnerable wherever they may be. We'll show that the best are full of conviction and that our values will prevail.
Our chief political correspondent, John Craig, is with me here on Downing Street. And John, the appointments haven't stopped. They're going on late into the night. You've got some more news for us.
And they'll continue tomorrow, yeah, and possibly even the next day. Sometimes reshuffles take 3 days. Yes, 5 more in the last few minutes. Jo Churchill, she was the MP, if you remember, on King's Speech Day, was, as the ritual has it, imprisoned in Buckingham Palace during the King's speech. Anyway, Jo Churchill becomes Minister of State at the Department for Work and Pensions. She was a Minister at Health previously and a whip before becoming a whip. Andrew Griffith, he becomes Minister of State in the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. He's moving from Junior Minister at the Treasury. Damien Hines, MP who's bounced around lots of government jobs, going to be Minister of State in the Department for Education. And I think he'll be Schools Minister, taking over from Nick Gibb, who's going. Nigel Huddleston, he's a minister who's had a few jobs. He was Sports Minister at one point. He's going to be Financial Secretary to the Treasury. That's Andrew Griffith's job. And lastly, Andrew Stevenson, Minister of State in the Department of Health and Social Care. So I don't think there's probably still some more ministers of state to be done. The unsung heroes, if you like, of any government. They take bills through the Commons and so on. And then, of course, there's the junior ministers. Perhaps, I guess, when it comes to the junior ministers, we'll probably see more of the 2019 intake getting jobs.
OK, so that reshuffle continues, as you said, into tomorrow, maybe the day after that. In terms of the big headline grabber today, John, you know, we all thought it was going to be about the sacking of Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary. We saw that coming and we thought we'd be talking about that. But when David Cameron walked up Downing Street today, after the shock had worn off, what did you think of his appointment?
Well, I've been talking to MPs over in Parliament and they think it's a smart move, a masterstroke. It's gone down well with all those MPs. But bear in mind, a lot of MPs in Parliament now became MPs when David Cameron was first leader of the party, 2005, and then Prime Minister starting in 2010. And of course, some of them owe their positions in Parliament to the so-called A-list at the time, get them into Parliament. So there's a lot of MPs have got a lot of time for David Cameron, and they are pleased by this appointment. Brexiteers, less so, because they remember his role supporting Remain in the Brexit referendum, and some of them are saying tonight, let's wait and see if he supports our current policy on Brexit. But I would say the majority are pleased with the appointment, but Tory MPs certainly, although polling has been mixed.
OK. John, thank you. Well, David Cameron walked out of British politics 7 years ago now, and after leading the Remain campaign to defeat in the Brexit referendum, his return to the government as an unelected member of the House of Lords has raised a few questions about accountability. As John said, there are questions for Rishi Sunak as well over the wisdom of appointing a man who was on the wrong side of the most consequential piece of UK foreign policy in decades. Our political correspondent Rob Powell reports.
Back in the loop, the 7th Foreign Secretary in as many years for a politician who's been out of office for just as long.
So we'll have a new Prime Minister in that building behind me by Wednesday evening.
It was 2016, after the referendum, that David Cameron resigned as Prime Minister.
Thank you very much.
Singing himself out of Downing Street. Brexit, undoubtedly his biggest foreign policy legacy, leading the Remain campaign, but failing to convince voters.
I do think that David Cameron and Rishi Sunak realise that they do need to work with Europe, and they do need to be in a position where we've got a perhaps better trading position than we have at the moment. So is David Cameron going to suddenly start making all the old Remain arguments? Is he going to go out there and do that? No, he's not.
In office during the Arab Spring, David Cameron was ultimately criticised for the UK's intervention in Libya, with MPs calling it incoherent and ill-informed. On Asia, too, the world has changed since he shared a pint with the Chinese premier and held a golden era in relations.
These days, we have a much greater awareness of the security risk posed by China. So I think people will want to hear the assurance from David Cameron that we're not signalling a return to the sort of approach that we saw previously.
Back home, David Cameron criticised the axing of the HS2 rail line to Manchester last month, and he became embroiled in a lobbying scandal after taking a job for the billionaire Lex Greensill and approaching ministers about his now-defunct financial services firm.
There are multi-billion-dollar lawsuits all over the world related to Greensill, and each one of these is going to involve lots of sort of additional information that's going to come out about Cameron's role.
Sniffed at for hunkering down in a luxury shepherd's hut to pen his memoirs while Parliament grappled with Brexit, Lord Cameron now has another chapter to write. His closing words to MPs in 2016 now seeming somewhat premature.
After all, as I once said, I was the future once.
Rob Powell, Sky News in Westminster.
Well, just how much could today's reshuffle affect the electoral maths at the next general election, which is expected at some point in the next 12 months? Well, I'm joined now by Sky News election analyst, Professor Michael Thrasher. Michael, good to see you on the UK tonight. Thanks for joining us. First of all, your thought when you saw David Cameron walking up Downing Street?
Like everyone else, very surprised. It's seldom that ex-prime ministers join a cabinet. The last time was in the 1970s, and before that was in 1917. So these things don't happen very often. So I was very, very surprised.
Yeah, it's not unprecedented, but it is highly unusual. Even David Cameron, Lord David Cameron, said that himself. How do you think this feeds into a general election picture? That's normally what reshuffles are around at this time of the year, around maybe 12 months, maybe less outside of a general election. David Cameron's part to play in that? Do you think that could have any effect?
I think to a degree, but of course, when it comes down to how people will vote, how the Foreign Secretary has performed is fairly low down on the list of priorities for most voters. It is an interesting step. It does demonstrate that Sunak can perhaps, some people would say, creatively. Others might say it's a step backwards, appointing someone to such a senior position from the House of Lords. It doesn't necessarily demonstrate a belief in strong democracy. But having said that, he is now building a cabinet around him that is going to be more loyal than the one that he's inherited before. And so in that regard, he's set the scene, if you like, for the next general election. But when it comes down to making voting choices, people are going to vote more on management of the economy, cost of living crisis, the state of the health service, issues that are relevant to them as individuals rather than what is happening in the Middle East or Ukraine or wherever.
Not just David Cameron, but the other appointments he'd made being more centre of the party, many of them. Is this an admission, do you think, that he is willing to give up slightly on protecting the red wall and move to the blue wall and go for the votes there tactically? Do you see him, moving in that direction? Is that your takeaway from it?
Well, let's be realistic about the Conservative chances at the next general election. Because of the boundary changes, their majority has increased from 80 in 2019 to 94 now. So if they lose 47 seats, they've lost their overall majority. And any reading of the current national polls suggests that there's very little certainty that they can withstand loss, that they will be able to defend those seats. So to all intents and purposes, the Conservatives probably themselves, they won't admit it publicly, of course. Why would they? But privately, they will be saying to themselves, look, this election is lost. And the real, if you like, ambition that Sunak and the Conservatives have now is to avoid a massive defeat. A massive defeat is what the current polls are telling us. And they've basically, therefore, got a year to erode the 20-point lead that Labour currently have over them and make it, if you like, more manageable and avoid that catastrophic defeat, for example, as they suffered in 1997, where it took them 3 general elections to come back before they could win an overall majority. So I think that's their real objective now.
Yeah, that's what the picture looks like at the moment, and polling is telling you. What about other parties, the Lib Dems, Greens and Reform, the Scottish Nationalists even? How are they feeding into the picture right now?
Well, they are relevant to this outcome because, essentially there are 2 parties that are in play in terms of forming the next government. One is the Conservatives, where I've already said there's very little prospect of them holding on to their majority. And then there is Labour. And Labour's challenge is enormous, simply because they lost the 2019 general election so badly that they have a mountain to climb in terms of achieving the smallest majority at the next general election. The reason, therefore, that the other parties are relevant, for example, in Scotland, the SNP are terribly important to Labour. If the SNP do implode as a result of various changes in the party and the status of the SNP, then there's a potential for Labour to gain a lot of seats there, and that will be crucial to a Labour government. Labour governments don't arise without a strong performance in Scotland. So that's one area. The Liberal Democrats are poor in terms of eroding the Conservatives in the south, but that really doesn't help Labour greatly. Labour's ambition is to form the next government, and every seat that the Tories lose to the Liberal Democrats isn't a seat that's won by Labour. So Labour is starting from a position of just over 200 seats. They have to get past 325. That's the scale of the task facing Labour. And it would require a record, post-war swing for Starmer to be in 10 Downing Street, bigger than Blair got in 1997. So that's the question, really.
Well, Professor Michael Thatcher putting us in the overall picture there in a build-up to general election, 12 months or less. We wait to see. Thank you so much, Michael Thrasher there, Sky News election analyst, joining us on the UK Tonight. Thank you for your time. Still to come on the programme. An investigation is launched after 5 members of a family, including 3 children, died in a fire at a house in West London. And remembering one of the greatest of all time, thousands line the streets of Manchester for the funeral of Sir Bobby Charlton. And CCTV captures the moment a stolen digger smashed through a pub in Nottinghamshire.
I'm David Blevins, and I'm Sky's senior Ireland correspondent. I'm based in Belfast, a city transformed by peace, but still struggling with its past. Politically, the two sides are as far apart as ever, and it's over that question of who has sovereignty in Northern Ireland, the very issue that's been the source of tension here for generations. It takes 60 minutes to cross the Irish Sea. It took the British monarchy a century. I've spent 25 years reporting the journey from conflict to peace.
The political parties of Northern Ireland have reached agreement.
We help you understand the world with us.
Today, we have reached an agreement with the Conservative Party on support for government in Parliament.
We already know what the government gets out of this deal. What exactly does the DUP get out of it? Well, £1.5 billion. Welcome to Winterfell. It's an iconic location in this globally acclaimed drama. Ophelia was the most powerful hurricane this far east in the Atlantic on record. You can't live in a place like this and not appreciate the environment.
The 5 of us have made it out of the car.
Welcome to Backstage, the film and TV podcast.
Welcome back to the UK Tonight. 5 people have died and 1 person is missing after a fire at a house in West London last night. 3 of those who died are children, while 1 man managed to escape from the house in Hounslow before emergency services arrived. Police say they're keeping an open mind about what started the fire. Sky's Matthew Thompson has this report.
The smiling faces of a family touched by tragedy. Seema and her 3 children are thought to have died in a fire that destroyed their family home. Their father, Aaron Kishan, survived. At one point, 70 firefighters battled the blaze as it engulfed the house, destroying 2 floors and much of the roof.
Tragically, when the breathing apparatus crews entered the property, they discovered 5 persons who have sadly been pronounced dead at the scene. Just to add the thoughts of the London Fire Commissioner, everyone within the London Fire Brigade, to the friends, family and local community.
At the scene, a heavy police cordon was in place throughout the day as neighbours and relatives arrived desperate for news. Shock, disbelief and grief have been the emotions visibly on display here at the scene today. I spoke to one cousin of the family who was visibly distressed. He and the many friends and relatives who've come down today had one question on their lips. How could this have happened? For the moment, police are keeping an open mind as to the cause of the fire, but investigations are well underway to give grieving relatives the answers they seek. Matthew Thompson, Sky News in Hounslow.
Well, let's take a look at some of the other stories making news in the UK tonight. And Indy Gregory, the 8-month-old girl at the centre of a legal battle over hospital treatment, has died after her life support was switched off. Indy was born with a rare genetic condition, and doctors said that she was suffering from significant pain and distress. Her parents fought to overturn multiple court rulings in their attempts to keep her alive. Well, Indy's father said that they were angry, heartbroken and ashamed. An inquest into the murder of Police Sergeant Matt Ratana has found that he was unlawfully killed after fellow officers failed to conduct a safe and thorough search of the prisoner who shot him dead. Lewis de Zoysa, who was taken into custody in Croydon in September 2020, officers failed to find a gun that he'd hidden in an underarm holster. Moments later, de Zoysa opened fire, killing Sergeant Ratana. Speaking outside court today, Sergeant Ratana's family said he would still be here if it wasn't for the failings of officers.
Matt was killed doing the job he loved in a police station which should have been a place of safety and security for him. If it wasn't for a catalogue of serious failings, and if people had done their jobs properly, Matt would still be alive today. The shoddy and inadequate search undertaken by the police officers was a neglect of their duty and left Matt vulnerable to murder.
Police are appealing for information after a thief was caught on camera taking a digger for a joyride and ramming it into a pub in Nottinghamshire. CCTV captured the shocking moment. The digger storming through the garden of a local pub, the Mucky Duck in Clayworth, before the driver flees. Police believe it may have been a targeted attack on the local icon and are appealing for information. Still to come on the UK tonight, the World Health Organization says that the UK government must step in and help families who they say are being exploited by baby formula companies. We'll have more next with our national correspondent, Tom Parmenter. Hello, welcome back to the UK Tonight. Now, the World Health Organization has said that it wants the UK government to act over rising baby formula prices, and companies are exploiting families for profit. This comes after Sky News uncovered earlier this year the desperate measures many parents are having to take to feed their babies, including stealing formula or buying it on the black market. And now the World Health Organization has urged ministers to intervene on behalf of those struggling families. Sky's national correspondent Tom Parmenter has this report.
The money started coming in very quickly because people like me, they were seeing the video report and people thinking the same as me. How on earth can this be happening in this country?
It started within hours of seeing what was going on at baby banks across the UK.
I had Sky News on in the background and I just vaguely heard about food banks struggling to give formula out to parents because of the cost of the formula, and they're having to actually ration it.
He is a dad of 4 from Essex who decided to do something.
I think the motivation for me and a lot of the people donating is just this cannot carry on.
Simon's crowdfund has raised over £50,000, which is now helping families struggling to afford baby formula.
We are just going out buying the milk and getting it to the food banks.
We join Zoe, making the first deliveries.
I'm upset that it's general members of the public that are putting their hands in their pocket to help others. It's really heartwarming, it's really nice, but people shouldn't have to do that.
The next stop was Southend-on-Sea, where we met Martina and her 2-month-old son.
When you see the prices on the supermarket aisle, what does it do to you?
My jaw drops. My jaw literally drops because it is expensive and it is exploiting us young parents.
You feel exploited?
Definitely. It does feel like you like get attacked, if that makes sense.
The sense that I've got is that as quick as the formula's coming in, it's going out again. Literally, they cannot get enough of the stuff.
First time in many months that we've completely run out, but this will make just such a huge difference because people come in, they need to feed their babies, of course they do, and we haven't been able to give it to them.
What we've seen in so many communities now is that it is public donations and charities that are feeding babies right across the UK. All of them say this is not sustainable. The World Health Organization is scrutinising what's happening. Lawrence Grummer-Strawn, their lead on infant feeding, wants the formula industry to be held to account.
Are families being exploited?
Yes, I think that we can say that. When you see that these prices are being driven down to the consumers and having to pay extremely high prices, they're in a very vulnerable situation, that they have infants that have to be fed and there aren't many alternatives out there for them and there aren't really other companies they can turn to, then we would say, yes, that you're exploiting them to increase the profits of these companies, and they have huge profit margins. As these prices go higher and higher, and it's going to be reaching beyond their limits, we really want to make sure we're not making mothers feel guilty. This is not their fault. This is problems that the government hasn't stepped up and supported them in ways that they need to. And we really need government action to address either on the price end or in ways to help those families directly.
The formula companies blame high production costs for the price rises. The Westminster government says they are helping with the cost of living. But the formula fundraising tells a different story. Simon has now teamed up with a national charity to spread this across the country. But they all know that one van and the kindness of strangers will never be enough. Tom Parmenter, Sky News, Essex.
And Tom's with me now live in Downing Street. Tom, this is a massive intervention from the World Health Organization, and it really puts the pressure on the people behind that door there.
Is this a tipping point? That really is the question that comes after that intervention. And really, the World Health Organization do not make these kind of interventions lightly. And the clear message from Geneva that we heard in that report is that they need to take government action right here to support British families who are in these often really difficult situations through absolutely no fault of their own. We've tracked this issue all year and we've tracked it all over the United Kingdom. And the questions as to what do you do to sort this out are difficult. should there be a price cap? Should it be £10 a tub per formula? Should there be something like a relaxation of the rules around the point of sale of infant milk? At the moment, those rules prevent people from collecting or spending loyalty points in a supermarket. Calls for those to be relaxed, but they are in place to promote breastfeeding, which everyone agrees is the best way of feeding a baby. But of course, that isn't possible for every family for all kinds of different reasons. And so tonight, I suppose, the questions that we're left with as a result of that intervention from Switzerland is, how do we go forward? We know there are also calls for Healthy Start vouchers to be increased. They no longer cover the cost of a tub of formula. Calls this weekend for that to be raised by 20% in next week's autumn statement here in Westminster. And we did put all this to the government here in Westminster last Thursday, and they still have not responded. And for every mother, for every father, for every charity worker, volunteer, even people putting their hands in their own pockets now to try and sort this out, they all tell us you cannot ignore it.
OK, Tom, thank you. Let's bring in now Erin Williams, co-founder and director of Feed, a charity which aims to end infant feeding inequality in the UK, the organisation mentioned in Tom's report there. Erin, thank you so much for joining us on the UK tonight. As Tom was saying, could this be the tipping point? This is the World Health Organisation getting involved, putting pressure on the UK government, using words like exploitation. What did you make of the intervention?
Well, I hope it is the tipping point, and Feed are absolutely with the World Health Organisation in this one. I mean, we've had formula prices rising way beyond inflation, and quite frankly, we've had a very vague justification from the formula companies about rising costs. But infant formula in the UK has just become unaffordable, and I think Tom hits the nail right in the head when he says, you know, it's public donations and charities that are feeding babies across the UK, and it's just not sustainable, so we need action now.
Yeah, Erin, it's not sustainable, but you're doing what you can. The good people of the UK who's, well, it's not their job to help parents feed their babies, but they're putting their hands in their pockets. Simon Harris, we saw in that report, who I know you're working with, who after seeing Tom's investigation on Sky News felt compelled to act, wanted to do something. And it's basically the kindness of strangers that's helping these families to feed their babies, and that just isn't right. Give me an idea of the scale of this and what's going on in the UK at the moment.
I mean, this is something that we've been trying to draw attention to since 2018, and it's just getting worse and worse every year. As Tom has shown through his reporting, the demand for infant formula at food and baby banks is increasing, and as you say, the work that's been done by the third sector and by people like Simon Fundraising is fantastic. And we try to do what we can to help families in any small way, but it's not going to shift the dial on infant food insecurity, and we really need the government to take direct action.
Yeah, the World Health Organisation saying the UK government, I'm standing outside number 10, the people behind that door need to do something to sort it out, because effectively they're saying that those who make baby formula are exploiting families on the price because formula is so expensive. And we've just talked to Tom there off the back of his report about the steps that can be put in place, the measures that can be put in place to help that. And some of them are really simple and can be done quite quickly. What would you like to see done to help families immediately?
There's three key areas I think that the government need to move on. The first one is making sure that families with wee babies have got enough income to be able to feed their children. And as Tom mentioned, a good place to start would be to expand the eligibility and increase the value of Healthy Start. And that's something that we've been campaigning for alongside our partners in the Healthy Start working group. And we're happy to say that the Scottish Government took steps to do that in April, and it is making a bit of a difference for families. So we want Westminster to follow suit. I think the next thing we need to do is really demand answers for the formula companies, because, as I said, this increase in cost is very vague, and we've tried to get to the bottom of exactly how much it costs to produce a tub of formula, but that information hasn't been forthcoming. So I want to see the government getting into the nitty-gritty detail to actually look at what are the costs of producing formula, where can we make savings, where can we put caps to bring that price down. And, you know, I appreciate that formula companies are businesses. They've got to be sustainable over the long term so that they can keep producing formula. But when we're in a scenario where parents are buying half-used tubs of infant formula in Facebook Marketplace to feed their babies, then I think the feelings and the profits of the formula companies have to come quite low in the list of priorities there. And then finally, I think I'd like to see the Westminster government following again in the steps of the Scottish government and really recognising the huge amount of work that the third sector, or the essential sector as they're becoming more known, alongside frontline health staff, to actually give families formula in an emergency when they need it. And we'd like to see the government support the third sector, the healthcare workers, local authority and other sectors with clear guidance on how they can provide formula in an emergency for families, taking a cash-first approach, but also being pragmatic, and that sometimes we have to directly provide formula. And the good news there is that people have already done the work for them, and we've got some guidance on our website that organisations can turn to help.
Exactly, and that website is, Erin, before you go?
www.feeduk.org.
Because in the meantime, it is the good people of the UK who are helping out those families. That call to action from the World Health Organization putting some pressure on the government. We wait for the government's response. But in the meantime, Erin Williams, co-founder and director at Feed, thank you for your time on the UK Tonight.
Thank you.
Now, thousands of people line the streets of Manchester today to remember one of the greatest footballers of all time, Sir Bobby Charlton. The Prince of Wales was amongst the mourners at Sir Bobby's funeral at Manchester Cathedral today, along with Sir Alex Ferguson and Gareth Southgate. Sky's chief North of England correspondent, Greg Milam, reports.
In the city where he made his name, at the stadium where he became a legend, one final appearance for Sir Bobby Charlton. At Old Trafford, under the memorial to those young teammates lost in the disaster in Munich that he survived, to become perhaps the greatest in English football history.
Across to Bobby Charlton, another great goal.
A World Cup winner whose name became a byword for excellence and integrity. And for fans, this was the passing of a generation.
He was one of the best. The best. He was warm, he was friendly, because he talked to him when he talked to you. He wasn't like stuck up or anything.
Sir Matt Busby passing, George Best, all the greats passing, and you know, for me, this is now, it's the last candles just gone out.
The procession through Manchester was a chance for this city to say goodbye. To Manchester Cathedral, for Sir Bobby's family, the private grief of loss shared with the world. The great names of football and the world beyond paying their respects. To hear him described as a superstar who remained a gentleman, football's best and most revered ambassador.
He's one of those people that is synonymous with the word football. You could go around the world. I remember as a young man, you'd travel anywhere and you could go to places where no one spoke a word of English, but they knew too.
I just wonder what you made of that service.
I was somber, it was wonderful. I think his grandson did a fantastic job at that age. When we got up there and speaking with such beautiful words and able to put it all over the right way, it was fantastic.
They'd heard him described as a man cherished in this city and around the world. A city, a sport, a country, saying goodbye and thank you. Greg Milam, Sky News, Manchester.
Remembering Sir Bobby Charlton in Manchester today. Let's get the latest sport now from Sky Sports News and Nick Powell.
This Sky News Sports Bulletin is brought to you by Vitality. Getting more people more active. Live life with Vitality.
Now this might look like any old bus stop in South London, and for most of us, that's exactly what it is. But for Isaac Chamberlain, this represents something much bigger, because this is the place where he decided to change his life forever.
Some of the stuff that I saw when I was growing up, a bit crazy. Gang violence, stabbings, you see police raids and all of that. If you're grown into it, you don't really, how can I say it, you don't really think it's anything crazy, do you know what I mean?
At what stage did your eyes become open to this as something that you actually might be involved in?
No, you don't really look at it like that. It's kind of like you're just having fun with your friends that you're growing up with. You start off obviously playing football together, and then everyone's together, and then, you know, one person starts doing something, and then everyone joins in, and then it's kind of like a clique of friends, then it turns into a gang, and it kind of goes that way. If you're from a certain area, everyone kind of knows everyone. Do you know what I mean? Everyone's familiar with everyone, and they're like, hey, yo, little man, hey, come over here, da, 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 da. How you doing? You right? Whatever, whatever. And you see them with their chains and their money and stuff, and you're thinking, bro, I want to be like him.
Is that the appeal?
Of course. Like, they have the money, they have all the girls and all of that, and you're like, bro, I want to be like them. They're the top guy.
So what were you doing?
Sell drugs or give this package to this person and come back with whatever they give you. Don't really look in the bag. But then obviously you start carrying knives, then you start, you know, holding things for people and all of that. And yeah, man, you just don't know how it could go. The rabbit hole gets real deep, man.
Was there a moment where you thought, this isn't something I want to do anymore?
Yeah, in one moment, obviously, it was near Knightsfield Estate.
Take us back to that day. What were you doing?
Obviously, picked up some Class A drugs. He was on the bus. I think it was, I don't know, 133 or 333. Maybe stopped on this exact bus stop. And then obviously we're coming out, we're thinking, yeah, job's done, whatever. We see.
This Sky News Sports Bulletin is brought to you by Vitality.
Still to come on the UK tonight, Cabinet reshuffle or transfer deadline day. We'll be discussing how the Conservative social media department chose to announce Rishi Sunak's new team.
Well, we all saw the Aurora display, which was a fantastic reminder that we interact with the solar system. It's the energy charged particles from the sun that cause the atmosphere, the gas in the atmosphere to glow, and that gives us the northern lights, the Aurora Borealis. Steve is a little bit more rare. It is related to the northern lights by way of the activity from the sun, but it appears as this kind of surreal streak of light across the sky. Sometimes it appears purpley pink in colour, and sometimes, in particular last night, it appeared to be quite white. And we believe it's some form of powerful stream of plasma. Now, if you cast your mind back to school days, you probably remember there are three types of matter. There's solid, there's liquid, and there's gas. Well, actually, there's a fourth type of matter called plasma, which is a gas which is electrically charged. And Steve is a powerful stream of plasma racing through the atmosphere. And it looks quite wonderful. It's quite rare to see, though.
Why is it called Steve? That's the first question that sprung to mind when I heard about it today.
Well, there are supposedly links to the kids' movie Over the Hedge. If you remember in that movie where this hedge appeared to the animals one morning, they decided to call it Steve to make it less scary. There's rumoured to be links to that, but it's an acronym for its official title, which is a strong thermal emission velocity enhanced. And that gives you a clue that actually it's quite high temperatures. And it's the velocity of the plasma through the atmosphere which gives us that wonderful light colour. I kind of prefer the Over the Hedge story, though, rather than the official. It is related to the activity on the sun, but I've only ever seen it once before from Norfolk, where I live. But last night, because we saw the Northern Lights, a very powerful display of lights, which is caused by this massive burst of solar particles.
Five of us have made it out of the car.
Welcome to Backstage, the film and TV podcast.
Now, welcome back. We always like to end the UK tonight with something weird and wonderful from around the UK, and today it seemed only right that it was about the cabinet reshuffle. The Conservative social media team have been really busy today. They were compared to football journalists on transfer deadline day, with the slightly unusual way that they announced ministerial movements on social media platform X. Well, the official Conservatives' X account started the day by announcing the reshuffle, saying, "Here we go," in capital letters, a phrase made famous, of course, by the football journalist Fabrizio Romano. They also added, "Rishi Sunak strengthens his team." First up, James Cleverly's move from Foreign Secretary to Home Secretary, the Conservatives' X account calling it a huge move, with a strong arm emoji. Next up, of course, the biggest move of the day, David Cameron becoming Foreign Secretary, announced on X, accompanied by a flame emoji. And the theme carried on throughout all of the announcements. You get the drift, don't you? The last one of the day, Esther McVey signs for Cabinet. Done deal, and starts today. John Craig joins me now. I mean, John, did it have the... I suppose for political correspondence, it is the equivalent of transfer deadline day, right?
Yeah, of course, yeah. And, I mean, I suppose the David Cameron appointment, I suppose, would be like, I don't know, like Harry Kane signing for somebody and we weren't expecting it. I mean, we were expecting him to go to Bayern Munich. But
it reminded me of Sol Campbell going from Tottenham to Arsenal.
Yeah, that was
That's the big one, isn't it? Yeah, that would have got a flame emoji
I'm just
back
looking
in
at
the
the
day.
Esther McVey one, actually. It says, Esther McVey, Cabinet Minister, will stand up for working people. And they've been saying that she's going to be the Minister for Common Sense. I mean, to be fair to Esther McVey, in a cabinet full of toffs, public schoolboys and Oxbridge graduates and Bullingdon Club members, you could say, is a breath of fresh air. I have to say, though, a bit churlish perhaps to end on a bit of dissent, but there is some dissent about David Cameron tonight. There is Ian Duncan Smith, who is obviously one of the big critics of government talks with China. He's known as a China hawk. He says, as one of the 7 sanctioned MPs in Parliament by the Chinese government for exposing the terrible genocide in Xinjiang and who are regularly attacked online by Chinese wolf warriors, I'm calling for greater clarity over David Cameron's financial links with the Chinese government. So I think we might expect to see a little bit more about that, because David Cameron has, while he's been out of Parliament, out of politics, been quite close to lobbying perhaps for China. And of course he was very pro-China, he and Mr Osborne, when they were in the government. Let me tell you just one other thing that's happened in the last few minutes. That is, Ben Riley-Smith, the political editor of the Daily Telegraph, is claiming as an exclusive Sunak offered David Cameron the Foreign Secretary job last Tuesday night, before Suella Braverman's Times piece kicked off that row. They met face-to-face in the number 11 flat. That's the one above number 11, not this one here, the one next door, bigger, on Tuesday evening. And our colleague Sam Coates has been saying that he reported already they decided to sack Suella after the weekend before last, possibly because of an interview that she gave to Sky News when our colleague Ali Fortescue went to Greece with her to talk about deportations of migrants and so on.
There you go. The inside track with John Craig, our chief political correspondent. Stay with us live from Downing Street next. It's News at 10 with Anna Botting.